Anne, thank you very much indeed for that. You've got us thinking. And I suspect Robert will continue to get us thinking even more. So, Robert, over to you.
Just a quick point before I begin, so to speak, on Indians and the way that the development of the information industry has changed the reputation of the Indians. I lived in Berlin for a year in 2000, and at that time there were reports in the press of Indians saying that until very recently, that is recently before 2000, when Germans talked to them in the street, the Germans assumed that they were from the restaurant business. But as of 2000, when Germans spoke to them in the street, they assumed that they were computer technicians. It made quite a difference to the respect in which they were held. Unfortunately, I agree with the broad thrust of Anne's book, which I have to say I only got in the middle of this afternoon, and I had many other things to do between then and this session, thanks to Penguin's failure to deliver us our copies. However, I certainly do agree on the essential role of markets, the essential role of private property, rights, limited liability companies. I'm not entirely sure myself, from where I stand, looking at development studies, how many people disagree with those propositions. They may not emphasize them in the way that Anne does, but I would suspect that if you did some sort of poll, a very large majority of people, including in NGOs working on development issues, would agree with those kind of propositions. And I also largely agree with what Anne said about corporate social responsibility, about global standards on environment and labor, about NGO unaccountability. I wrote a year ago a paper called Accountability Gone Wrong, which was a critique of NGOs in their campaigns against the World Bank. And I largely agree with what Anne said about the Millennium Development Goals. But now comes some qualifications to all that agreement. The book is a polemic. Just like Noemi Klein's book is a polemic, they are at the same level. And like all polemics, and there is a very useful role of polemics and advocacy books, they make, this book makes, both books make very selective use of evidence and arguments. The theme of Anne's book is that business is a victim of NGO activists and other apparently well-meaning people, and business must be defended against its attackers. It actually reminds me, much of the tone of the book reminds me of Martin Wolf's book called Why Globalization Works. Martin Wolf actually gives a very fulsome endorsement of Anne's book. Why Globalization Works was published in 2004, and it is, as you can infer, a ringing defense of globalization against the massed ranks of anti-globalization forces. The trouble is that just who these forces are that the world needs to be alerted to is not actually very clearly spelled out, but they are described in terms of forces, and this is a quote, massing inside and outside the gates. That's the kind of language that Martin uses in order to frame his polemic, his advocacy for globalization. And Anne makes extensive use of Martin Wolf's arguments. Just in parenthesis, I have to say that while I am quite critical of that book, I do think Martin's work on the his writing on the financial crisis now for the past 2 years has been quite exemplary. But his earlier work on globalization, I think, is subject to the critique I've just made. and makes extensive use of Woolf, of Bagwati, of Philippe Legrain, of David Henderson, and not much use of serious arguments by the people that those people are criticizing. In other words, doesn't really engage with the arguments. And that's the point of an advocacy book. You don't engage seriously with the arguments of those you're criticizing. You set up, if necessary, straw men so that you can then knock them down in order to advance your advocacy arguments. I'm particularly interested in the question of the role of the state. And as Anne just said, she makes some positive remarks about the role of the state. She says, for example, this is a quote, "Successful societies need markets and states," and underlined. And in terms then of what states should do in this pro-business agenda, well, states should provide infrastructure investment, she says, mentions the US highway system constructed in the 1950s as a positive pro-business role of the state. Military procurement helped to build up the US aerospace industry. That was a good thing, pro-business. There's a role of the state in curbing negative externalities of businesses. For example, Anne says, sometimes the activities of companies create negative externalities that require regulation. Who would disagree? The state has a role in national defense and policing, and also in managing the money supply and creating macroeconomic stability. But then Anne goes on to say that beyond these things, states beware. And the whole thrust of the agenda is for liberalization, deregulation, such as, for example, this is a quote, "Economic liberalization is key to enlarging and strengthening the role of business," unquote. Quote again, "Virtually every economy presents largely unrealized possibilities for deregulation and liberalization." So this notion of the role, of the appropriate role of the state in development, notice that it's couched in universal terms, although Anne said that she's against universal standards and prescriptions, is very consonant with the Washington Consensus, or with, if you will, neoliberal economics. And I want to just talk a bit about this. The Washington Consensus has been encapsulated in a very specific set of ideal arrangements, a universal set, a single set of ideal arrangements in terms of policies and in terms of institutions for all developing countries in a formula that the World Bank calls the CPIA, which stands for Country Policy and Institutional Assessment. So every year, the World Bank ranks each of its borrowing countries in terms of about 16 dimensions of policies and institutions on a score from 1 to 5 according to their goodness for development. So countries that get 5 have the best in each domain, have the best set of arrangements in that domain. The interesting question then is, what is the content, the World Bank's content for these ideal arrangements? Well, just to take, for example, trade policy, and Anne very much endorses free trade as the prescription for developing countries. The fact of the matter is that the bank also strongly recommends free trade, as in to get the top score of 5 for Uganda or Brazil or China or whoever, you have to have free trade. The bank specifies this scoring system. Only countries that have free trade get the top score. Similarly, in terms of labor market institutions, to get the top score in labor market institutions, you have to have no worker protections. Virtually no trade unions, certainly not trade unions that have any clout. Now, interestingly, the bank has a very independent evaluation group, and it's called the Independent Evaluation Group, or IEG. The Independent Evaluation Group has recently done a study of the CPIA, and rather to my surprise, I confess, it comes out with the conclusion that the CPIA must be radically revised because there is no serious evidence supporting the scoring criteria for things like trade policy and labor market institutions. And so, very slowly, an effort against a lot of resistance is underway in the bank to revise the criteria for scoring countries according to ideal policies and ideal institutions. Now, this effort at rethinking some of the prescriptions that Anne and so many others have given for the role of the state has been given an impetus by the fact that the chief economist of the World Bank since end of 2007, replacing Nick Stern, is Justin Lin. Justin Lin is Chinese, and he's the first ever non-G7 chief economist of the World Bank. And he is trying to nudge the bank away from, and Anne will surely support this, thinking of things like the Millennium Goals, the Millennium Development Goals, and poverty reduction as the central problematic of development, and towards thinking of production, productivity growth, technology growth, industrial policy, technology policy, towards this set of issues as something that the bank should be much more actively paying attention to, promoting in developing countries than it has been for a long time, in fact, since roughly the mid-1980s. And he is feeding in some of this thinking to the G20 leaders meeting in November. You probably know that the G20 leaders will be talking about development really for the first time in November. And the Koreans, hosts, have brought in some assistance from the World Bank, and Justin Lin is a key person. However, you mustn't think that the World Bank is changing its mind on development, because there's a strong pushback against these notions of moving away from poverty reduction, moving away from market liberalization towards things like a more active role of the state in promoting industrialization. There's tremendous pushback within the bank from Justin Lin's own economists. Interestingly enough, perhaps surprisingly enough, Justin Lin is getting support for this agenda from the IFC, the International Finance Corporation, which lends to private companies, and from the finance and private sector development part of the IBRD, of the core World Bank. These parts of the bank are coming out in support of this kind of move, whereas the kind of standard economists, both in Justin Lin's own research department and in the more operational parts of the bank, tend to be the ones who are resistant to any notion that the state should have a more active role in promoting productivity growth, technological upgrading, and the like. And they are trying to kind of draw the line and say, no, the state must concentrate on just market liberalization, privatization, deregulation, plus poverty reduction. And just finally then, my last point, on the poverty numbers, I think the numbers that you use in your book, and which you use to celebrate, and you make this proposition, to celebrate the role of something called globalization causing poverty reduction in India and China especially, those numbers are now out of date, very out of date. In 2008, the World Bank announced major revisions in both the GDP of developing countries and in the poverty headcounts in developing countries. And the revisions were mostly downwards, and including, in the case of India and China, dramatically downward revisions in the GDP, in purchasing power parity terms, of India and China by roughly 38%. In both cases, 38%, one of the biggest ever statistical revisions of an important statistic. And the other side of that downward revision in their GDPs and purchasing power parity terms was that the poverty headcounts in both India and China went up by hundreds of millions of people for the same year. This is the year 2005. And so one has to be careful using the poverty numbers, whether one uses the numbers the bank published in 2008 and has now been using, or the numbers on which most of the literature still uses, because it's not up to date. That is the numbers before 2008. But anyway, with that caveat about the poverty numbers, and with my qualification or amplification rather to your notion of the appropriate role of the state in development, I agree with a lot of what you said.